Come Saturday this week, Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong will meet with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Japanese Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi over in Hawaii to discuss North Korea-related matters. For more, I have Professor Min Chung-hoon from the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. Professor Min, welcome back.
My pleasure.
I also have visiting Professor An Jun-sung from Yonsei University. It's good to see you again, Professor An.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Min, let's start off with your thoughts on the significance of the upcoming trilateral talks among the top diplomats from Seoul, Tokyo and Washington.
Well, as the news mentioned, that there will be the trilateral meeting or the trilateral meeting among the three countries, South Korea, U.S. and Japan, in order to mainly talk about the North Korean issues. But for the past 2 years, the ministers of the three countries talked about the North Korean issues when they met in the multilateral meetings like G7 or G20 meetings. But this time, it is known that the U.S. asked South Korea and Japan for having a ministerial meeting. It's like a separately scheduled meeting in order to just mainly talk about the North Korea and the nuclear programs. So I think that it shows the U.S. perceives North Korean repeated provocations seriously, and it also expresses an intention that the U.S. want to move forward to resolve the North Korean issues. In addition, I think one of the main reasons why North Korea got repeated provocations nowadays is to draw U.S. attention. So I think the holding the ministerial meetings among the three countries in Hawaii this time will be a clear message to North Korea, showing that U.S. is taking care of North Korean concerns.
Right. And Professor An, ahead of Saturday's diplomatic exchange, top nuclear envoys from the three countries are also poised to hold their own talks. Now, I suppose countering North Korea's nuclear ambitions will dominate those talks then. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree with that. I think that the main agenda would be how to deter North Korean nuclear program. And however, three countries, right, they have different views on the situation. That's the real kind of concern, right? And for example, the South Korean government want to restore the Korean Peninsula peace process, including the end of war declaration. However, the Japanese government is more interested in on the CVID, complete verifiable, irreducible, and dismantlement. So there's a really extreme position, maybe that which used to be taken by U.S. government, right? And also, but however, the U.S. government also have a different view on the same issue. Although they're getting together in the same place, like Honolulu together, but they have a different maybe priority the way from the government. So that's, I think, a little bit concerned, and we'll have to wait and see how will they come up with their press conference.
Right. Professor Min, pundits claim that diplomatic tensions between Seoul and Tokyo have largely hindered the trilateral cooperation, despite efforts by the Biden administration to push that framework forward. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree. And I think that it has not been easy for the three countries to closely work together, mainly in terms of the conflict between South Korea and Japan. And regarding the North Korean issues, as Dr. An mentioned, I also think that South Korea and Japan have got different policy priorities. Specifically, I think the South Korea has emphasized the resuming the nuclear talks between the North Korea and the U.S., while Japan put more importance in the North Korea's denuclearization measures and maintaining economic sanctions on North Korea than the resuming the nuclear talks. And the U.S. has been standing in the middle and tried to strengthen the trilateral cooperation. Meanwhile, North Korea has not responded to U.S. requests to come back to the negotiating table. So I think there has been no clear momentum or the meaningful momentum to move forward. And therefore, the three countries just to stick to their own policy priorities on the North Korean nuclear issues. It's not good news for South Korea.
Right. And talking about policy priorities, another issue to be addressed during the talks, as you mentioned, Professor An, is the Moon administration's proposal for a formal end to the Korean War. Having said that, what appear to be the stances of the U.S. and Japan, respectively, with regard to this proposal?
Well, I mean, the different view, right? As I mentioned, that the U.S. government is quite different from Korea and Japanese government, and especially you see that what happened in the Ukraine recently, and there was some conflict with the Russian government, and there will be expanding two battle at the same time against China and Russia. I mean, that's really big, I think, pressure on the even U.S. government. Right? But at least they try to send a message to North Korean government and say, well, we're still paying attention to you, but problem is that here, North Korea is not the primary concern for the U.S. government, obviously. So their prime concern will be the China or the Russia in this the Ukraine situation. So, but at least they're making a political gesture saying that we still pay attention to you. They're crying baby, strategy. But we'll listen to you. But you have to come to the table, come back to the table to talk to us, right? There was problem. However, traditionally, I mean, they try to prefer bilateral talk rather than the multilateral. So that's kind of another problem issue. Some problems, but still, you have to open conversation and continue to wait and see how they responded.
Do you see Japan supporting calls for an end to the Korean War, like a formal end, that is, like the one that the Moon administration is hoping to achieve?
Well, very interesting question, right? There's, yeah, but I think yes and no, right? I mean, at least officially, they agree, right? But unofficially, there's some comparative advantage issues. And plus, is it really even Chinese government want to end the war? There's a lot of political, not only the politics, a lot of economic concerns. So I think that's why in order to get any international support would be better. But still, each country have some their dispute, their own issues, problems. Especially we have so many issues with Japan, right? It's not only political and cultural and a lot of issues, economic issues, right? So eventually I think that if we want to get really peaceful, 22nd century, maybe in the future, maybe you need to get end the war in the eventually sometime. But its question is the when. I think it's question, right? So I think the Japanese government will agree with the getting end the war declaration is a good move, right? Move toward the future, I think, better future.
Right. Well, support for efforts to formally end the Korean War has been voiced by the head of a liberal political party over in the UK as well. We take a moment now to listen to the words of Ed Davey, who tabled a related motion to the House of Commons last summer.
I thought the idea of formally ending the war could be really helpful in reducing tension on the Korean Peninsula. And therefore, I wanted to find ways to encourage the UK government to do all it can here in the UK to accelerate those efforts, working with international friends like Brad Sherman and people in the United States. And we discussed how we could take that work and involve other parliaments and other countries. We talked about France, we talked about the EU, maybe Canada, maybe Australia, and try and get some international momentum behind this idea to bring a formal end to the war from the 1950s, and that helped change the atmosphere. I think these provocations from North Korea only strengthen the case for initiatives to try to resolve this. I think we need an injection of diplomatic urgency, and I think the work of Representative Sherman with his bill and my motion in the House of Commons can help provide that.
Right. Professor Min, what is the significance of such support for a peace framework on the Korean Peninsula from both countries directly involved in regional matters and those that are not?
Basically, I think it shows that the international community supports for the end of war declaration and the peace on the Korean Peninsula as a whole. And I also think that the international community support for the declaration could provide the momentum to encourage North Korea to get back to the negotiation table or resume the nuclear talks between North Korea and the United States broadly. And specifically making progress or the passing bills or resolutions for the declaration could provide the kind of the momentum for North Korea to consider whether or not to come back to the negotiating table. As you know, the failure to reach an agreement in the 2019 Hanoi summit negatively affected Kim Jong-un's leadership in North Korea. And then North Korea has made an argument that it can return to the negotiation only when U.S. takes back its hostile policy on North Korea. So I think it's necessary for whatever reason for North Korea to get something that it can utilize in order to save the Kim Jong-un's face and get back to the negotiating table. So I think the end of war declaration could be a policy signal that U.S. is willing to change its policy on North Korea, and it could provide the momentum or the space for Pyongyang to consider returning to the negotiating table. Pyongyang desperately needs to get something that it can take advantage of domestically.
Right. And Professor An, how do you respond to the thoughts shared by Sir Ed Davey in that particular interview that we had?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Actually, two things. First one, I think I agree with that. Forming an international momentum, I think that's a really good move, right direction and right move. And second things, would it be more effective if we get more your neighboring country would do the same thing? Like Japan. Can they do that? I mean, I think they will really sincerely try to get the help with Korean government to solve some issues. Resolve some problems. Maybe they should come up with some goodwill gestures, such as maybe they can have end the war, not from the UK, far away from Korea, something neighboring country which is really having some of the issues, and showing goodwill gesture would be good. Good move to work on to upgrade our relations in the future, right?
And having said that, Professor An, what are your prospects of securing that kind of regional support from countries around here for tangible peace on the Korean Peninsula, of course, amid Pyongyang's persistent missile tests?
Well, I think it's basically one, how you getting ally here. I think the problem, big picture, is that now U.S. government want to get their ally, formulate, strengthen their ally. Same thing to UK, the Russia and China, because try to get embraced in Japan. The North Korean government, right, to kind of form a comrade, getting together, making forces. So I think it's very concerning that we might miss some of the very important things. For example, like a lot of issues with the North Korean, we have something common interest in Peninsula. North and South Korean government, right? Maybe you can play with it, but if the U.S. government kind of pushing South Korean government to, either your ally or enemy, right? That's really very, it's not the best, approach, because that if you do that, you lose your flexibility on the diplomatic situation. That's a little bit concerning on international politics perspectives.
Right. Professor Min, quite contrary to expectations, North Korea's two-day parliamentary session earlier this week ended on a relatively quiet note in the absence of its leader, Kim Jong-un. What are your thoughts?
Well, basically, I think that North Korea is trying to focus on the coping with its economic difficulties. As you know, North Korea has got serious economic situations, mainly in terms of the COVID-19 economic sanctions and the natural disasters. And in terms of the COVID-19, North Korea had to close its borders for the past 2 years. But nowadays, it seems that North Korea resumes its trading activities with China and Russia, although it's not clear whether North Korea has fully controlled the further spread of the virus throughout its territory. So I think this situation shows that North Korea cannot close its borders anymore, mainly because of its economic hardships. So, and I think that, but meanwhile, I also think that the reopening the borders could be the positive signal to resume the nuclear talks between North Korea and the U.S. because North Korean delegates could get out of the country for the negotiation. And regarding its relations with the U.S. and South Korea, I think North Korea is waiting for the upcoming inflection point, upcoming South Korean presidential election next month. I think North Korea is fully aware that it's not easy for South Korea and the U.S. to move actively to resume the nuclear talks because it's almost over for the current presidential term of the Moon Jae-in government of South Korea. So after trying to enhance its negotiation, the power through the repeated provocations, Pyongyang, I think, is waiting for the situation where the next or the new South Korean government reveals its policy orientation on North Korea.
Right, I see. And moving back to the upcoming talks over in Hawaii, Professor An, what message do you expect the trilateral talks among Seoul, Tokyo and Washington to share perhaps with Pyongyang?
Well, I mean, personally, unfortunately, I don't think much there's a big message change because there's nothing much changed. They haven't talked. Neither side haven't talked together. So they maintain their initial position. Like U.S. also taking their own position. Also, North Korea is not changing their position. So I don't expect much significant different message from the previous ones, right? It's going to be very similar. I think more important here is that looking at big picture, it's more important that the three countries get together and try to get trilateral action, getting together and then try to, speak in one voice. I think that's the big issue. Sending a message itself, the process itself, sending, I think, big message to North Korea.
Right, showing perhaps a unified front.
Yeah.
Professor Min, some claim Washington's interest in bolstering the trilateral cooperation is simply aimed at countering Beijing. How do you respond?
Well, yes, I agree with that kind of point of view because basically I think that the Biden administration has put its policy priority on toward the East Asia on tracking the rise of China. And I also think that the U.S.-China strategic competition also affects U.S. policy toward the Korean Peninsula. Well, as you know, the Biden administration tries to track the rise of China in terms of mobilizing its democratic allies and partners like South Korea and Japan. And so I think that South Korea-U.S. relations and U.S.-Japan relations have been strengthened since the inauguration of the Biden administration. And interestingly, the U.S. has put the emphasis on the working together with South Korea and Japan, even when it deals with North Korean issues. So I think that tracking the rise of China through the close working together with its democratic allies and partners like South Korea and Japan will be maintained throughout the term of the Biden administration. So I think that the U.S. will put the more emphasis or the importance in the improving the trilateral cooperation among South Korea, U.S. and Japan than the improving its relations with North Korea.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor An, given tensions between the U.S. and China, as well as those between the U.S. and Russia, there are political analysts who believe the alliance among China, North Korea and Russia will gain strategic strength. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you see that what happened in Ukraine, right, situation. And then, very interesting, you see that Ukraine actually bordering not only Russia, also bordering China. Very small, but it's interesting because Chinese government never speak about it, because it's a national security issue as well to Chinese government, but they didn't say anything. So I guess very wondering, and if they will talk about the day maybe Putin never invaded during the Beijing Olympics game, something, but they say it's not true, something. But a lot of things going on between the two countries, two superpowers, and it's kind of that kind of changing of environment, atmosphere is kind of helping actually North Korean their positioning because they got more friends now, right? Because they kind of has been isolated by even the Russian government, right? Because the stronger political tie between Korea and Russia get a stronger, and even the Chinese government, they have much stronger economic tie with two countries. But however, now because of political reason, because of the Biden administration kind of pushing, either your friends or your enemies, right? The situation, you take one side. So that's really concern about from the country like Korea, right? You have to take one side, but you have to get. We don't have much, discretion on this problem. So you have to very carefully decide how to move in and which direction. Big picture is really better for us, as a big picture, right?
Right. Professor Min, what does the potential formation of two separate blocs with South Korea, Japan and the US on one side and North Korea, China and Russia on the other mean for peace efforts perhaps here on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, generally speaking, I think that the security situation of the Korean Peninsula and the relationship between North Korea and U.S. were more stable and positive when the U.S.-China relations was good or favorable or okay. But nowadays we have the situation where the competition and confrontation between U.S. and China are getting deeper and tougher. So the space for cooperation between the two countries is getting smaller, right? So it's not easy to expect that the two countries are willing to work together just for the issue of North Korea when the two countries got the serious competition for the advanced technologies and other things. And in addition, U.S., as I mentioned before today, the U.S. tries to track the rise of China in terms of mobilizing its democratic allies and partners like the South Korea and Japan. And China is doing the same thing, right? China is also trying to mobilize its close all the friends or some colleagues like the North Korea, Russia, Pakistan, and Iran and others. So if the countries are divided into the two blocks or groups, like you mentioned, I think the space for enhancing cooperation across the blocks or the groups for the North Korean issues is likely to be getting smaller, right? So it means that South Korea needs to put more efforts to move forward for the peace process of the Korean Peninsula, as U.S.-China strategic competition is getting intensified. Another good news for South Korea.
Right, I see. And very briefly speaking, Professor An, what are your thoughts on the prospects of a bilateral meeting between Seoul and Tokyo in the upcoming talks in Hawaii?
Oh yeah, I'm sure they will try to do it. I mean, it's very common. Even the multilateral meetings, like the WTO meetings, they have a bilateral, always trilateral. It's very common, so it's not surprising at all. And one side asks for the bilateral meeting because there are only 3 countries, right? And the question is that how productive solution they can come up with. That's really questionable because that, as we mentioned, we talk about Sado mine issues and the UNESCO issues, right? And are they willing to do it? I think that since possibly they're just taking a political gesture, because of the UNESCO, and they don't want to see strong protest by any member of other countries. Like the Korean government have a very strong protest on it, and even the U.S. perspective, and they want to, basically, I think the U.S. government kind of using the bad cop, good cop situation. They try to be good player, and they're using all the bad things, making the Japanese guy did it, like CVID. It's like, why do they really care? I mean, frankly, I don't think that they really care much. They're thinking about the regional security. That's true, but
right.
Do they really want that specific CVID? That's the different issues. So I think that's really focused on. They will have the meeting, but we have to see what kind of things. As I mentioned earlier, if they can come with some goodwill gesture, just like the end of war declaration, helping if the Prime Minister of Japan come out press, well, we support President Moon on the end of war declaration. That will be a good gesture.
Right. Yeah. Hopefully, we will see some progress on that front then. Right, Professor An, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thank you.
Professor Min, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.